Welcome to the second video episode of Unnecessary Improper. I think this is the end of our first season, the beginning of the second season.
It's a transitional note, much like we are in a period of transition.
Exactly. It's an arbitrary line we draw on this podcast that no one listens to.
Totally arbitrary.
And you are tuned in. We are going to talk about the end of identity liberalism.
So,
of all things.
It's sort of last Sunday in the New York Times opinion section, a professor named Mark Lilla, he published an editorial it's entitled "The End of Identity Liberalism," sort of in response to this election and to what Democrats have been doing for sort of the past 8 years or so. He was criticizing this emphasis on identity, specifically things like race or gender or sexual orientation, as something that is sort of divisive and not helpful to the Democratic Party. So I think we all had a chance to read it and reflect on it, and I want to know sort of what your biggest takeaway from it is as it pertains to just sort of in a vacuum or as it pertains to this election.
Well, as you're familiar with it, I'm curious what your kind of like just elevator summary is of his thesis.
This is going to be a touchy subject, by the way.
Yeah,
sure.
I think we're probably going to hit on strike some nerves.
Yeah. Certainly.
Good. I like striking nerves.
Okay.
It's the best. Yeah. Anyway.
Rohan, remind me to never go to you for dental.
Dental work. No, but if you were to summarize his kind of thesis, how would you summarize? First, because you're familiar.
Yeah. So his thesis is more or less that Democrats for too long spent sort of these past 8 years emphasizing sort of certain identities, and sort of the line that it sort of stuck out to me was if you're going to mention people specific identity groups, you better make sure you mention all of them, otherwise they're going to feel left out. So on the campaign trail, Hillary Clinton would oftentimes refer to African Americans, Latinos, LGBT, sort of other communities that have for a long time been sort of unmentioned and ignored. Or marginalized, in American politics, in American society, in American life. Yeah, I mean, Mark Lilla specifically wasn't criticizing that she did that, but he criticized a glaring omission, and that is sort of the working class, or not just, we got working class individuals, but also just sort of white people as a whole. I think he mentioned sort of for a long time, and even today, you've got the sort of Democrats have been demonizing sort of angry white men. You had Van Jones on CNN the moment sort of it was very clear that Donald Trump had won the election, saying that this was a white lash.
I know, it's funny you mentioned that. I watched that live that
same.
night, and first of all, Van Jones is an incredibly eloquent political commentator.
Yeah.
And his kind of, like, I don't know what you call it, treatise at the moment on that kind of, on the effect and kind of engaging with Corey Lewandowski.
Which may not exactly have been supported by the data if you look at the...
Sure. Regardless of where it fell on, like, the kind of...
supported by the data.
Yeah.
Where it fell on, like, the accuracy of the political spectrum, it was a very kind of thought-provoking sentiment, I think, of kind of this election being a referendum on divisions in the country that are cultural and also socioeconomic.
Yeah.
So before we kind of get into this kind of article, I have a question for... the white members of the podcast, the two of you and me.
I'm still going to respond to it.
Please. No, I want you to as well. But
Well, Rohan, you are a noted white supremacist.
Yeah, noted white supremacist. But so I'm curious if, like...
It is written.
I mean, white
He's
people...
been to the rallies.
In this article, like, the notion of, like, white people, like, the white culture is... It's kind of crazy to me, too. Like, it's kind of its own topic in and of itself. It's not really a kind of contiguous culture. It's not a culture like...
And neither is... And
neither
frankly,
is anybody's
There's no such
identity
thing
culture.
as black culture. There's no such thing as Indian culture writ large. I think it's inappropriate to say there is a... And you have conservatives... I mean, this is the classic conservative line.
So, Boyle, are you
That's a
trying
hot
to say
take.
that white culture is more disparate than black culture?
Wait a minute. Hold on. We're getting into the weeds, like, so quickly.
No.
And bulldozing past the point of the article.
This is irrelevant. This is good.
super relevant.
The precursor I was making
The
is
weeds
that,
are the weeds. When we get into them, we're into it.
Yeah, no, my precursor is that I don't...
We head right for the weeds.
We can retreat always. But
No, I don't think that white culture is as distinct or as existent as black culture. I'm not black, so
I mean,
it's
for
hard
me,
to judge, but
I always get where
Our viewers now know.
when you
You're not
hear
black.
I know.
when you hear
Certifiably not black.
when you hear the
Make-up, I'm
term
not
sort of
black.
black culture, oftentimes sort of you associate it with like conservatives talking about like race and police and like black culture if they're lazy. Like I think that's why I get really worried when we refer to like sort of monolithic cultural groups because it's a way to just paint people with a broad brush that I think Democrats do. I mean, there was just this assumption in this election. This is going back to the sort of about Latinos, for example.
Yeah.
That look how inflammatory Donald Trump has been. When it comes to sort of talking about Mexicans, and yet he did better amongst Latinos than Mitt Romney did. And so there is this. I think what this article touched on is that Democrats have been sort of have very much generalized identity groups, and it's sort of if you just mention like, oh, we're pro Latino, well, there was always this assumption that Latinos would be within the fold of the Democratic Party, and what he mentions, Mark Lilla specifically mentions, is as sort of minority groups stay in this country longer, especially when it comes to immigrant groups, which you can sort of refer to as sort of racial groups, as they stay in this country longer, inevitably their politics become more sort of divergent. So it's no longer the case that Latinos are this monolithic group in society. It's not the case that Asians are a monolithic group in society, especially when it comes to political ideology and factions.
Well, I want to hit on there's an interesting point in the weeds that we immediately have. I think what's interesting about culture is that it evolves in many different ways, and it comes from many different sources. And I think when you say there's a black culture, there is a white culture, there is you're saying that there is more of a black culture than a white culture, but here's what to
condense it into a monolithic statement.
Which might just be a factor of
but wait.
Size of population, if we're going to.
But wait, so what's interesting is so you can take two different the example that you can give is okay, cuisine, right? Southern cuisine is like a thing.
Southern cuisine, sure.
Southern cuisine. A lot of Southern cuisine, because of the history of the United States and because of the history of racial groups in the United States, a lot of Southern cuisine has become black cuisine. Yeah? And I think many African Americans have adopted kind of this or the culture has evolved in such a way where those dishes have been passed down through black families, much as they have been passed down through Southern families, Southern white families.
Okay.
On the flip, and that is kind of that's an element of culture that evolved from the geographic area of the country and the history of that geography. There are other aspects of black culture that have evolved out of people rallying together around the fact that they are black and that they have a common history of being black in the United States. So, for instance, there are songs and there are all kinds of aspects.
What
am I driving at?
Yes.
What I'm driving at is you can't just say there is more of a black culture than there is a white culture. I would say that there are parts of our culture as the culture, the multicultural United States that have evolved because of many different things. Some of them are revolved around, because there are pieces of art that are inherently born out of black struggle. Or minority struggle.
I'll refine my take then. I guess the take that I kind of wanted to I think is relevant to this discussion is the article talks about kind of the left abandoning the white working class worker as a social group, kind of in dialogue. That is interesting to me because when you put the white working class social group on the same table as the LGBTQ community, the notion of community is very different, because I think that while I'm not working class necessarily, I guess my current kind of stanchion, I think that the notion of being white is just so much more diffuse and kind of disconnected than a lot of the other groups that I guess the left has focused on historically. So I think that it's interesting to enter the lexicon and the conversation with the same value, or the same kind of on the same playing field remotely.
Sure.
I think
that might just be a numbers game. I think there are so many more white people. And so if you want to refine white people to smaller categories, you might get more monolithic seeming groups.
But the guy's point,
coastal elite white people, southern working class white people,
Appalachian white
Rust Belt
people,
working class, sure.
Rust Belt working class, right? And all of those, maybe, I don't have the numbers here, but all of those might be about as big as some of these other minority groups, right? You've got your West Coast liberal white people.
Right.
I mean,
and
those are all substantially more monolithic. So maybe it's just as simple to say as any group of 50 million people is about as monolithic as any other group of 50 million people.
Okay. Maybe then the question is...
So what I want to say, sorry to cut you off, is I think the important thing here is the implication of this article is I think has to do with democratic politics. And sort of to what extent is it productive for Democrats to keep calling people out and sort of keep referring to people based on certain identifying features, mainly race, but also gender and orientation, as a manner of distinguishing them? And also, to what extent does it... I don't want to come across by saying that sort of the trials and tribulations of name any marginalized group are not real or aren't there. But to what extent, when it comes to coalition building,
And
politics, which is sort of politics is coalition building. Do you need to address sort of a higher level of connectivity? I mean, is it like Donald Trump sort of, I think, tapped into economic anxiety and and I think it used to be the case, among other things. It used to be the case that there was this idea of sort of like this American identity that I think unified us,
so to speak.
Yeah. And that is very much, liberals do not really do that as much anymore. And I don't mean to say that, we had this discussion earlier, but when we talked about Colin Kaepernick, I don't mean to say that protesting the, sort of kneeling for the anthem is in any way un-American, but liberals get to this sort of, there's been this erosion of an American identity that liberals don't go for anymore. It is common practice in college campuses. This happened in Brown on Veterans Day. Kids put out, students put out flags. Student veterans put out flags to commemorate Veterans Day, and student activists said this is a symbol of white supremacy and threw them in the trash. I mean, we've gotten to an extent where the American identity is not there anymore, and instead we're referring to people by these sort of racial or other identitarian groups.
Yep.
And to what extent is that more divisive than it is productive for this country?
And what I want to say is that those groups are a terrible proxy for policy, right? Absolutely terrible. When Democrats and Republicans, whomever, say Republicans, say, white people, you should support us, right? And Democrats say, black people, Latino people should support us, right? It's more like what I think is much better saying, talking to what people believe rather than who they are. So people who believe in limited government, people who believe in economic freedom, you should support Republicans traditionally.
Do Democrats have an ideological sort of position now? I mean,
that's
their ideological position is very much, it's not, the Republican Party, the Conservative Party is the party of limited government, the party of sort of economic freedom.
Well,
what is presumably, again, on paper,
on the thinnest of historical paper.
Yeah, but to what extent what is the Democratic Party? It's the party of, you might call it civil rights, maybe not civil liberties, but civil
Certainly
rights.
Not civil liberties.
The party of civil rights, sure, and other sort of, I guess we'll just say civil rights, but you have to have more than that. You can't just be, we're the party
And what they certainly are is the party that just talks a big sympathetic game towards marginalized groups in this country.
Two things. The first is, so now you've honed in on this as, and I think the article goes broader than this, but you've honed in on this as a political strategy for the Democratic Party, this identity politics. I think the article makes a larger point about when we talk about liberalism in the United States, and kind of just as an ideology beyond what a party is using as its strategy to get somebody elected. How do we think of it, and what is the most productive way for our country to think of each other and think of its identity and our identity as different people and our identity as a diverse country. So that's point A. Point B, to your point, was about how this corresponds with policy. The trouble is, we talked about this and how people vote on different issues, right? And I think that there are points in our history when somebody's racial identity is really important to the policy decisions that they're striving to achieve. You know what I mean? So like,
but it's still 1 degree removed.
If a group is marginalized and they want policy changes, they're rallying as
and the policy
has
their
to
do
group.
With their
and the policy is
for sure.
So but policing, for example,
policing, I think,
could be an issue.
In 2016 is an issue that takes
in the struggle of civil rights, though. To say vote for our party because you're black and we're going to do good things for black people is very different than saying vote for our party if you believe in an America that is an inclusive place for all minorities and we are going to be striving for that future, because that's such a broader coalition of people who believe that than black people.
True.
And this is
and that's the policy, and that's the Martin Luther King I have a dream type of rhetoric that I think is
more
broader, more positive, and has a much larger appeal rather than say,
kind of like a Malcolm X versus a Malcolm X kind of message.
As it were.
That is more
and I think
racially charged.
Right. Then say, if these are your ideals, if this is the policy you want.
I mean, you could argue that's kind of why white people like Martin Luther King more than they like Malcolm X. I mean,
because
it is, but no, but it's to your point.
I don't think you're wrong, but who was more successful also?
Oh, I mean, well...
Again,
that might be
well, I think I personally am
my,
not qualified enough to make any judgment on that one, but I think...
Well, that's why
my point is my point is this,
Well.
and it goes back to kind of the first point that I was saying was I think that, you know, in the larger sense, I agree with you in the sense that I think that it's more productive for us as a country to now band together across gender identity, racial identity, all of these things. That said, I have to qualify that by saying I'm coming from a privileged background where I don't have to worry about being marginalized because of my racial identity, or because of my gender identity or sexual preference. You know, these things don't impact me directly and how people look at me and affect me. And so when I am saying I want to think of my fellow Americans as Americans, I want to strive for...
That gets read as...
It gets... Well, not even how it gets read as. You're right, it can get read as, he's a white guy, look at him, you know, being able to say stuff like this. But it's also just... It's a privileged thing that I'm able to say, perhaps.
So I'm glad that you brought up white privilege, because I want to talk about white privilege. And specifically the way that...
It's a hot mic.
Specifically, the way that liberals, Democrats, those who play the identity politics game, the way they toss that phrase around.
Actually, can I cut in for just a second?
Sure.
It's not just liberals playing the identity politics game. In this article, he specifically mentions the first successful identity politics group in this country is the KKK.
Yeah.
And the alt-right is an identity politics group.
Yeah,
so
very true.
let's be clear, it's not just liberals and progressives, but I will say, look what the flip side of identity politics looks like. That's what scares me about it.
And I just want to say, for my own relationship, and I'll let you go back in a second, for my own relationship with the Democratic Party and with liberals, it kind of bums me out, because I'm much more in the camp of, I want us to all be, can't we all just get along? And can't we all just kind of strive towards liberal policy and kind of a collective liberal American identity?
Or collective center-right American identity, if we're being realistic. But
the identity politics bothered me, because I felt ostracized to a degree from the liberals of my generation and the dialogue, because I felt like
and you
I can't even I felt as though I can't participate.
And sort of that you're a villain in some funny way.
To a degree, I wouldn't say that I felt. Yeah, I mean it gets really dicey. It gets really dicey.
It's a really interesting revelation that you felt ostracized.
At a very liberal place,
liberal, NYU attending. You know what I mean?
At a very liberal place like NYU, where the identity politics kind of became the liberal dialogue.
Yeah.
It was unfortunate just because I am a very progressive guy.
Yeah.
And I like...
And yes, someone
as
progressive as you
ideals.
felt ostracized. Right. Imagine how anyone, somewhat to the right of you felt. Anyway.
So, and so that's sort of what I'm saying, though. You and someone else...
But I'm not a victim, and I never want to equate me being in that position with somebody else actually being...
But focusing on victimhood and focusing on injustice is not unifying. Focusing on progress and focusing on the America you want to live in and achieve is something that you and like a black person can talk about and both get behind. You know what I mean?
The counter to that argument, though, is that
look forward, not look back.
The counter to that argument is, when you say focusing on victimhood isn't productive, the counter to that argument is we haven't been focusing on this victimhood at all. That's why we are where we are today when it comes to race relations and when it comes to the status of X, Y, and Z minority groups. Well, I think because we don't focus on them, and I think it's sort of what identity politics, in my estimation, represents is an overcorrection. Sort of for so long it's been so ignored, and now we're going to overcorrect. And I think at some point the pendulum.
As well. That's what they said.
So I want to make
it's to correct.
So to what extent how do we overcorrect, and can there be an overcorrection when there's still injustice in this world?
Kyle, you gonna say?
So, onto white privilege.
Oh god.
I think white privilege is thrown around. First of all, I believe I'm drinking the liberal Kool-Aid on white privilege, so to speak.
That
I believe
exists, or what's
that it exists, and that it is incumbent upon people who experience privilege to.
Vanilla.
It's incumbent upon people to experience privilege to understand the history of it, and take that into account during interactions with everybody. But to go into the world as a mindful citizen, understanding and acting, sort of just understanding the privilege that one has been given and recognizing where you can do things to level the playing.
I want to push back at the notion though for a second. This is the brown guy pushing back against white privilege.
Brown guy and also the brown attendee.
Yeah.
Yes.
Both brown guy and the brown guy.
My
Sorry.
problem with white
Low-hanging
privilege
fruit.
is sort of twofold. First, I think the idea of like it frames sort of what we would hope is sort of what everyone experiences in this country as a privilege, as opposed to something that everyone should be striving for in some sense. Like privileges in some ways feel like above and beyond. Like they don't feel like a sort of a floor that we look for. It feels like it's above and beyond what you're due in society, right?
Yeah.
That's what we talk about someone who's privileged, right?
Yeah.
But I would hope things like people might say when you have an interaction with the police, if you're white, you don't have to worry about sort of the cop being sort of jumpy around you as white privilege. I would say that's the norm we should be striving for,
Yeah.
and it's sort of injustice that it's not happening.
It's your reference point, though.
It
right?
is a reference point,
Yeah.
and the other
Yeah.
part though is when you just refer to white privilege in a sort of a very base way. It is if you are, and I'm currently in the middle of Hillbilly Elegy, which we've already plugged in this podcast.
I just bought it.
But if you are someone if you're a white guy and you're out of work or you're to just say, oh, you're white, therefore you can't have ever experienced the kind of oppression that I have is first of all, I think it's very limiting when it comes to our discourse. Like when it comes to things like empathy and humanity for one another.
Be it
It's
limiting,
like-
is it wrong?
So it's a broad brush.
It's a very broad brush.
Sure.
And I think
And
Wait.
to the extent that I can't I could never understand everything what it's like to be Michael Eichert. Because, we
That's
cannot truly understand the next person because of the limitations of, what experiences are like.
Let me tell you,
So,
Roman.
so I think to some extent it is
yeah.
true,
Wait, I got
but
it.
to the extent that it's useful for dialogue and useful for coalition building and useful for solving problems in this country, I think it's not.
Yeah, and so just the point is that I was going to say is I was going to harken back to my first encounter with the term white privilege, which was at a party, and it was being
This is
just...
gonna be great.
I can't wait for the story.
was at a party, and I had published an article in the newspaper.
This is college,
was this
right?
in college?
This is in college, yeah.
The tartan.
The Tartan. It's Carnegie Mellon's news leader. And,
Among others.
Among others. And,
the tartan? Like the pattern?
The Tartan.
Yeah.
That's Carnegie Mellon's thing. The
Yeah.
Carnegie Mellon Tartans. That's our sports team name.
Yeah.
Our mascot is tartan, like a piece of tartan fabric.
That's pretty lame.
Yeah.
kinda
Well, I
weird.
went from the churchmen, equally timid and lame,
Yeah.
to the Tartans.
I'm the Quakers right now, so continue.
The churchmen to the other affiliation of churchmen.
Yeah.
But anyway, I was at a party and someone just came up to me and was like, I read an article that you wrote and you are so privileged, you have no idea what you're talking about. This is just white privilege. Which was the worst
Brutal.
counter argument.
You said, "Hey, how you doing?"
Yeah, actually,
Nice to meet
yep. Literally though, that was it. I was like, I'm Kyle. She's like, I know. I
Yeah.
was like, all right, Emily. But anyway, white privilege it took me years to come around to the idea that, and it's sort of almost like the Spider-Man quote, with great power comes great responsibility, because I also experience other kinds of privilege that are far more, in my opinion, concrete, and you can paint with broader brushes, like growing up in an affluent area, going to a very awesome private school, and then an awesome college. And I believe in giving back, and I believe that it is the responsibility of those who have a lot to give a lot. With great power comes great responsibility, to hear Uncle Ben tell it in Spider-Man. And so I believe in that idea, but it took me years, literally 4 years, to come around to the idea of white privilege, because it is used as a weapon, and it's used to silence people, and it's used to not want to address the merits of someone's argument, and to write people off based on their identity, which is the other sort of darkish side of identity politics.
Sure.
Is that it makes discourse, in so many cases, come down to, no, you're white, so you can't comment, or on the other side, if someone were to say you're black, so you can't comment on that.
But
What?
I was... I wanna say this.
Wait, can I-
Hang on. Either you discriminate,
Yeah,
either you
go ahead.
discriminate or you don't. Take down my argument on the merits. Don't
Sure.
take down my argument because I'm white.
No, listen.
And it is appropriate to say, you Kyle, how many times have you had an encounter with the police?
Right.
There is some level of
Go into the merit, yeah.
You lose some legitimacy to your argument because you've never sort of truly experienced it, but I also I think writing it off wholesale because you're white is
Exactly.
ridiculous.
Well, go ahead.
So
Go ahead. Sorry.
this is, fascinating to listen to. I think this kind of dialogue is just this is what I live for because it helps me understand things better.
And excuse my dog.
Yeah, sorry for the dogs upstairs. Very excited to be back inside.
Named after a notable white
But so
supremacist.
you talked about
I have no
white
idea.
privilege as a concept and a phrase that gets weaponized. I think that's kind of a common sentiment. I guess I think that while I agree with you that it ought not be weaponized and we ought kind of strive forward, moving, like, look ahead, I think that it's understandable that it gets weaponized by marginalized.
Well, because there's some.
Does that make it good?
No, but I'm
there's
just
like some
wait, hold on.
truth to it.
Man, I'm just hear me out. The only thing I'm trying to say is that it, like, after kind of introspecting a bit and kind of having these conversations with, I guess, people from different walks of life to a degree, it makes sense to me that occasionally that's what happens. That white privilege gets kind of weaponized.
Totally.
Is it justified? Therefore, no. Is it good? Therefore, no. But it kind of, like, I'm not trying to defend white privilege as a weapon, but I think that it bears, I guess, recognizing that it's being used as a weapon for a reason. It's because if you are an oppressed minority group and your life is kind of just completely, like, suppressed by, like, the systems of society, by the political dialogue, by every kind of intricate, like, system that operates in kind of civilization, that you are going to kind of want to lash back with something, and that's the fair thing to lash back with.
But it's not just as a weapon. It's also
No, I'm
just
just-
as
to
like
Kyle's-
a,
But
to
I'm saying
Kyle's
it's
point.
often used like that.
Yeah,
I wrote
yeah.
an article and I received an anonymous email one time that just started, Kyle Henson, you fascist pig, go back to your frat
Right.
house.
Well, so random people on the internet.
Right, but Rohan's been called a white supremacist because of an article he wrote.
Rohan is a white supremacist. Let's call
For
it
the
a spade.
record, I am not a white supremacist. I just want to look directly into the camera.
So Rohan has been called a white supremacist because of a very good, well thought out, reasonable article he wrote defending free speech. Like, when did free speech and white supremacy become like a thing? And in fact, free speech was sort of the 40 years ago, something that liberals and people who were civil rights advocates loved.
Well, yeah,
because
there
they
was
could hold rallies, freedom to demonstrate, freedom to gather and freely associate. I mean, those are things that have historically aided the oppressed.
I guess what gives me pause is the fact that I think that there is a lot of truth in just when somebody would say to you or me or you that, you know, they'll say, well, you know, you're coming from a different perspective. You're privileged because you are white. You're privileged in some regard, in some aspect that we're talking about, because you're white. Meaning, there's a perspective that I have because I'm coming from an experience of being a minority that you simply cannot understand, or you simply like. It doesn't mean that you can't have it, and I don't like when it leads to we can't have it. Therefore, we can't have a dialogue.
Right.
But what I do like.
The thing is, people aren't saying that, and they're not saying it like that either.
But hold on. There is truth in that.
Sure.
When you say that like, yeah, you're right. I don't get it. I don't get it from your perspective.
So tell me about it.
It doesn't mean that I can't have an opinion, but it does mean that, and I don't think that it even means that your perspective is less valid, but it qualifies your perspective.
But it doesn't mean that you can never understand it. I think there is this sort of essentialist, almost defeatist.
But wait a minute, there
going
is a degree to which you can never understand.
and that's sort of that very basic. There is, to some degree, I can never understand what it's like to be Michael Eichert. But similarly, you can never You're right. You can.
Yes.
That's just the nature of consciousness.
You're saying
and
it's
whatnot.
generic. You're not saying it's
Like, on a
one
very
way,
generic
oppressed
level.
to oppressors.
Yeah, but like
Yes.
some of that stuff comes from race. Like
Sure,
like some
yes.
of like a lot of people's experience could be
Yes,
based on
I
their
think-
race.
by
I
their
think
race.
you can get to a level of expertise where it becomes as generic as anything else.
What do you mean by that?
I'm saying
A level of
you
expertise.
can make, like, for instance, David Simon, I think, is a great example. David Simon is the creator of The Wire. He's also written a lot of books, and he has devoted his life to advocating for basically drug policy reform, prison reform, and police reform. And he has done this through several media outlets, and a lot of his media has been really successful in changing the dialogue on media reform. He is a white guy, but I think that his level of expertise and the way that he has dedicated himself...
Is like what, he gets it, what it means
and
to
the
be
way
black?
that he has dedicated
No,
himself...
not what it means to be black.
The way he has dedicated himself to these three issues makes him someone who can comment on the reality of these issues in a way that is very, very credible.
I'm not saying you don't have
I'm not
credit.
saying it's the same as a lived experience.
Right, that was my only point.
But I'm saying it becomes to the point where the lived experience is irrelevant because we can have a much higher level conversation because of the expertise that we now have.
Yeah, and our discussions should not be simply predicated on I have this experience and you don't, therefore. It should be more than that. I mean, we can't make public policy should not just be
Aspirational, I agree.
should not just be based off experiences.
I
know,
think
it
you
should be
should
sort of-
not you should not be disqualifying somebody from a conversation because they haven't had a lived experience. And going back to this article,
Yeah.
that is what alienates people. Is
Right.
if you say that
Yeah.
you don't have a seat at the table because
Or you do have a seat at the table, but shut up.
right,
Yeah.
yeah, right. What we're talking about impacts you, but your voice is
Is worth less.
Is worth less.
If it, as it were, white people are meant to be seen, not heard. In some cases,
Yes.
is sort of what
I have this was so actually I'll give it a
Wow,
little
what a turn of events.
No, I'll give you a little anecdote. There was a sort of on campuses across the country. There's been a movement for universities to oppose any sort of repeal of the deferred action plan.
Give some
So basically, a number of sort of students who are currently attending universities are they're beneficiaries of President Obama's deferred action plan, which basically lowers the priority of enforcement of immigration laws on them because they were born here, they've lived here for like 14 years, no criminal record, sort of a number of certain qualifications that basically the administration has said we're not really not gonna prioritize enforcement at all for you people because these are people who are very much on their way to being sort of productive Americans. And with sort of the election of Donald Trump, people are worried that's going to get repealed, and so students have been lobbying universities to designate their campuses as sanctuary campuses. So they will oppose the entry of Immigration and Customs Enforcement's ICE onto campus in order to sort of deport students. So universities have been sort of private universities don't really have that ability, but they've been
slash that standoff would be very ugly.
Yeah. No one wants to see university police versus ICE. But that's been a big thing that's going around. So there was a campus walkout that happened at Brown last week. I think it was last week. It was students were to walk out of their class and declare where they were going to just walk out on the main green and then go. And this white girl asked on Facebook, what exactly should I say? They say you should say this, but if there's a student of color in the class, you should let them say it. There's very much this this isn't your fight to fight, even if someone's like. And first of all, the idea that white people cannot be affected by immigration is patently absurd. I
have a Canadian friend who's equally existentially terrified about her future. In this country.
And there is that whole thing of being seen and not heard is a really divisive thing. This is what Mark Lilla gets at. He talks about sort of a post-identity liberalism and what that sort of would mean. And I wonder what that looks like because none of us, I think, deny that there are serious problems that affect certain minority groups in this country.
None of us also deny that identity liberalism perhaps cost Hillary Clinton an election.
Yes, and so
how do we incredible decision?
What does a if you agree with it, you don't have to agree with the idea, but what does post-identity liberalism look like that still incorporates really meaningful concerns that affect minority groups disproportionately?
It's the $1 million question.
Yeah, that's what it is. I mean,
but I think it is
that's
almost
ideal.
some of the same policy, just coupled with different rhetoric.
Yeah,
I think in a lot of
rhetoric
cases,
is hugely important. How you package it and
agree.
send it to the people
Yes.
is.
But I think it is. They need to talk
more
about
important than
like
what it is.
Obama's
Arguably
2004 DNC keynote.
Yeah.
Right? Where with this soaring inclusive rhetoric.
Black guy with a funny name can be whatever he wants to
Right.
be.
I mean that everyone can get behind that.
Oh, I watched that when I'm feeling down. That's
Yeah.
a great
I
thing.
watched that when I have to
that
give
is-
a speech.
That is not a joke at all. I completely agree.
I agree. I went before I've had to give several important speeches in my life. I hate Obama, but I've been.
You hated Obama?
I've watched him. I hate Obama.
You don't hate Obama.
I hate Obama.
Oh my god.
Anyway, but I watched that speech because it is a brilliant speech. I'll call a spade a spade. Obama's a great public speaker, man. But
wow, good. How magnanimous of you.
munificent.
Really hot
Munificent,
take.
I think is the word. But just in a similar vein, it shouldn't have taken me 4 years to come around to a new name for an idea that I already believed in. White privilege or wealth privilege or whatever. That just the idea that if you have stuff, you should give stuff, and if you have like advantages, you should work social good.
So here's the closing question though: does the dialogue of identity liberalism, and I guess identity liberalism itself, need to change for the Democratic Party to have a successful coalition and a successful kind of place in the
Yeah.
politics?
So
because you should have a place in the Democratic Party without feeling weird about it.
For sure. Going back to your point about like this as a vehicle for getting someone elected, I think historically this has worked well for the Democratic Party. This rallying around racial, identity politics.
I disagree.
about
Look at
that.
Bill Clinton.
Bill Clinton didn't do that.
Bill Clinton was very much all.
The whole country.
He talked. It was a very much. It was very inclusive. He talked about economic problems, things that unite all Americans. And maybe maybe the counter argument is yes, but he ignored like serious problems within minority communities as a result. So
Especially the Crime Act.
Yeah. I think that's the as you said, it's the toughest question is just how do you balance these things?
And there's the plausible narrative that Obama was the aberration with the historic nature of his candidacy. Remains to be seen.
So if it didn't,
but it might not have been effective.
well, I'd be curious to talk to this history professor about how this kind of evolved, because if it didn't evolve because the Democratic Party thought that it could get people elected, then how did it become?
Well, how much of a
it became a movement over the past 8 years, I think.
Yeah, I mean, how much?
Absolutely.
Yeah, and to kind of conclude things, I mean, that's a hard question to answer. Is how much was it a Democratic coalition, the leader's choice to we're going to go in this direction, and how much was the natural evolution of the Democratic Party? But so I mean, I think that this kind of dialogue, I think just inclusive dialogue where everyone just listens to what everyone else has to say and kind of sits on it for a bit, doesn't just kind of yell back, is honestly a hugely productive kind of.
No, it's not.
No, it's not at all. But so
and don't write anyone off because of who they are.
Yeah.
If your ideas are better, defeat your opposers in the court of public opinion on the merits.
The best advice I ever got about this kind of dialogue is just listen. If you when all else fails, just stop talking and just listen to what else someone has to say and think.
I think that is good advice.
Not everyone who disagrees with you is a racist, sexist, bigot.
Yeah.
Maybe there are people who are out there.
Oh yeah, there are some.
But if you're going to use those terms, use them accurately, use them carefully, because they're really charged.
And then it just becomes the liberal boy who cried bigot. I mean, these terms have lost so much of their power.
Absolutely. I think Bill Maher was keen on saying that I've been so at the same level for so long talking about Republicans. When Trump came along, I couldn't use.
Yeah.
The language wasn't powerful because it was the same language.
Yeah. If Bush was Hitler and
Yeah.
McCain was Hitler and Romney was Hitler
And now we're all like, Mitt,
Mitt.
I miss you.
So this has been Unnecessary and Proper. Effectively the conclusion of our first season.
Maybe.
No one really listens to us, but we thank you for listening to us. We're on the internet, unnecessaryandproper.com. We're on terrestrial radio in Pittsburgh, if you live in Pittsburgh, WRCT 88.3 on your FM dial, Pittsburgh's news leader.
Pittsburgh's video
and Pittsburgh's video's news leader. Send us an email, unnecessaryandproper@gmail.com if you want a topic to be discussed. Reach out to us on Facebook individually. And continue the dialogue. And we'll hopefully see you again, maybe in video soon, but on the internet, audio definitely soon. Thanks so much.